I'm Zachary Page. This is Shelf Life. I'm with University of Minnesota Extension RSDP, Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships. And yeah, we're doing Shelf Life, which is a monthly web series. And today we'll be talking about food co-ops with John Steinman and exploring alternative grocery ownership. And I'll say, take it away, John.
Great. Thank you, Zachary, and thank you to the University of Minnesota for hosting me. I am coming to you from Nelson, British Columbia, which is a small community. I wouldn't call our community rural, but certainly we are as far away from any big city as possible in southern British Columbia. And if you want to geographically orient yourself to where I am, we're about 3 hours north of Spokane, about an hour across the US border into Canada. But I was recently in Minnesota touring through Grand Rapids and Minneapolis and Duluth and Virginia and spending time both at urban co-ops and rural co-ops. And so I have quite a familiar connection to food co-ops and rural Minnesota because of not just that trip, but many previous trips I've been on. So yeah, really nice to be with you today. As you know, you probably already know, I'm the author of a book called Grocery Story: The Promise of Food Co-ops in the Age of Grocery Giants. My background is mostly as a journalist, but I've studied the food system. I've studied restaurant and hotel management. So I have a background in the business side of things, but mostly the past 20 years, I've been investigating food, investigating where our food comes from. And I have a particular interest in grocery, which is, I think, why Zachary identified me for this webinar. And I want to share a little bit more about what else I'm involved in. And before I do, a bit of a disclaimer, before you draw any conclusions or pass any judgments, just hear me out as to what else I'm involved in outside of being a journalist. So I also own a bank here in Nelson. It's a small bank, but it does have $315 million in assets, another $300 million in customer deposits. I also own here in Nelson a fleet of 25 vehicles, pickup trucks, small electric vehicles, gas-powered vehicles. I also own a network of gas stations here in the region. I'm an owner of a small radio station here in Nelson. I own a commercial grain mill, and I also own a 21,000 square foot grocery store here in Nelson. And so before you go off and think that who is this Canadian tycoon speaking at our webinar series here on rural grocery, perhaps some of you who are familiar with co-ops might know that I'm actually not the only owner of these businesses. And so this is a way for me to introduce some of the co-ops that I'm involved in. And so I just want to share a little bit about the co-ops I'm involved in because it helps to introduce why food co-ops and grocery co-ops are something I'm so interested in. So I've just pulled up my screen here, and Zachary, let me know if you don't see the screen. But so what I was speaking of when I said I own a bank is that I'm the owner of the Nelson and District Credit Union. And this is something that can often get forgotten, is that credit unions are indeed financial services co-ops owned by their customers. And so for me, I'm one of 4,000 owners of this bank. In fact, this bank, this credit union, also holds a small mortgage on my house. And so all the interest that I spend on that mortgage, on those mortgage payments, actually go into a financial institution that I own. When I spoke of owning a fleet of vehicles, this is the Kootenai Car Share Co-op that I am one of 325 owners of. We own 25 vehicles. So rather than each of us own our separate vehicle, or perhaps in my case, in my household, rather than each of us have our own vehicle, we can have access to pickup trucks and electric vehicles like the ones you see here. And just to back up for a moment, when I'm speaking of the co-ops that I am an owner of, among hundreds or thousands of other people, we're also speaking of businesses that are absolutely essential to communities, particularly rural communities and small communities like the one I live in. We're speaking of financial services, we're speaking of transportation, and fuel stations and gas stations are also something that certainly for those of us who still have vehicles that run on fuel, these are essential services. And so I am also an owner of a network of about 6 or 7 gas stations now here in the region. that is also a co-op. This is the Slocan Valley Co-op. I'm one of 5,000 owners of the co-op. And this co-op has been diversifying recently. Just over a year ago, the co-op, the gas station co-op, purchased a restaurant. So now I'm the owner of a restaurant and pub. That's me there celebrating my ownership among the 5,000 others of us who own this restaurant. And my history as a journalist really traces itself back to this community radio station that is one of only a few radio stations really we have where I live. Because we live in the mountains, the radio waves aren't as extensive. And one of those stations is Kootenai Co-op Radio, which has been around for over 25 years. It's where I got my start in food journalism. It's also where I recorded my audiobook, like you see here. And so I'm one of 2,000 members of this community services co-op. I mentioned a commercial grain mill. It's not as big as you think. It's actually this small flour mill that 30 of us in the community own together. We wanted to be able to mill local grains from farmers like you see here in the nearby Creston Valley. And we came together and purchased a mill that any one of us would not have been able to really afford or justify or rationalize to buy on our own. But together, we each have a key to this space in a building in the city. And lastly, I mentioned I'm an owner of a grocery store. This is the grocery store I'm an owner of. This is the Kootenai Co-op, which occupies the main floor of this mixed-use building. This co-op has been around for 50 years, dates back to the 1970s, so very similar to many of the co-ops in Minnesota. And I'm going to speak a little more about that in a moment, but these are the businesses I'm an owner of. And the reason I speak about it in the way I did at the beginning, describing that I'm an owner of these businesses, is it's intentional in that, I'm trying to repattern how we think about the businesses and services that we use. The dominant way in which we engage with these important businesses and services is often one of disconnection, where there is another business stewarding that service, or another person or company stewarding that service or that business. And co-ops are really a very different paradigm. And co-ops are all around us. Certainly in rural communities, co-ops are even more present. But just a few quick statistics and facts here. This year, 2025, happens to be the International Year of the Co-op. This was declared by the United Nations. There are 3 million cooperatives worldwide with 1.2 billion members. That's a considerable percentage of the global population. And we find co-ops in every sector of the economy: agriculture and fisheries, banking, energy, health, housing, insurance, sector-specific services, like, for example, grocery, which I'll speak of in a moment, media, which of course I showed an example of, technology, consulting, breweries, the list goes on. And when I speak about co-ops, I'll be speaking specifically about grocery co-ops, which most often are consumer co-ops. But there are different types of co-ops. The consumer co-op are the ones that are owned by the customers. Worker co-ops would be those owned by their workers. Producer co-ops, which would be many of the agricultural co-ops owned by farmers, or in the case of fisheries, by fishermen. And then you have other types of co-ops. Multi-stakeholder would be a combination of those three, or two of those three. Housing co-ops, financial co-ops, which are a form of consumer co-op, purchasing co-ops, platform co-ops, which are co-ops that exist only online as websites. And then social co-ops would be similar to the radio station I spoke of, or health services co-ops, which may be comprised of health practitioners in a community that work together in some cooperative way. And visually, just to also orient our awareness around co-ops, these here are all co-ops. Ace Hardware is a co-op owned by independent hardware stores. Blue Diamond, Ocean Spray, Organic Valley, CHS, Dairy Farmers of America, these are all producer co-ops owned by farmers. REI Co-op is a consumer co-op of outdoor apparel. I believe in Minnesota, perhaps the closest stores are in Minneapolis. Equal Exchange is a worker co-op. So this is a company that trades in coffee and chocolate and avocados and bananas, owned by their workers. And CHS is one of the largest co-ops in the United States. If you've ever filled up at a Cenex gas station, Cenex is actually owned by CHS, and CHS is owned by farmers. In fact, I believe 600,000 farmers across the US own CHS. So co ops come in every shape and size. Uh, in Minnesota, electric co ops, as is the case across the US, are also a big part of rural communities, supplying almost a quarter of all of the energy in the state. Credit unions, as I mentioned, another really important backbone to co-ops. And when we start to talk about grocery, which I'll be getting into, Associated Wholesale Grocers is an important co-op to mention. This is a co-op that's been around for 100 years, owned by non-co-op, independent, privately owned grocers. About 1,100 grocers across the US own Associated Wholesale Grocers. That represents around 3,500 stores. And this is a co op, and it's one of the oldest co ops within grocery operating in the US. So, why co ops? Why have they historically formed? Here are just three reasons. Co ops appear when dominant systems or institutions fail. They're they form when people start to understand that they're failing or that they're broken or that those systems or institutions have become too powerful. Perhaps they're no longer serving the needs of people and communities. And in some cases, people are inspired to start co ops because of the ethics and the morals that perhaps the system or institutions are operating with or without. Co ops make sense when they begin to make sense. This has a bit of a hidden meaning, and it's something I've learned over the years. I've watched co-ops form and understood how co-ops form. And again, they generally start to become something that's easier to initiate and easier to understand when any of those conditions in the first bullet point here begin to emerge. And what co-ops generally have done over time is they rebalance economic and social power. And so this brings us back, certainly as someone who's a bit of a historian, particularly in the way I approached writing my book, brings us back to the late 19th century, which was often referred to as the Gilded Age, where many of the co-ops we see today can find some of their lineage. Certainly, what we're seeing today in politics and in the economy is quite similar to how things were in the late 19th century, where the most powerful interests in the country were the trusts, the corporations, the companies that really emerged out of the Industrial Revolution. And it was through that imbalance of power in the late 19th century that led to what this author here, Karl Polanyi, would call counter movements. And so he was someone in the 1940s began to really look at the economic and social impacts of these economic systems that today we are still living within. And he said something really interesting that certainly connects to grocery and grocery retail. To allow the market mechanism to be the sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment, indeed, even of the amount and use of purchasing power, would result in the demolition of society. So he really saw a strong threat to markets and to society through an imbalance of power. And so what he spoke of were society's attempts to repair that disruption inflicted by the free market. And he called these counter movements. And so what we saw coming out of the Gilded Age was the Progressive Era. This was a form of a counter movement, in this case initiated through government institutions, that began to respond to that imbalance of power by introducing some of what today have become quite well known, like the Federal Reserve, including competition laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act or the Meat Inspection and Pure Food and Drug Act, which was one of the first acts to help regulate food safety. Up until that point, there were many concerns around food safety, particularly in the meat industry, and the Department of Labor protecting workers. So this was one way in which government was trying to help rebalance power. But there's a risk to some of that. And this chart right here is my very quick effort to try to describe one of the vulnerabilities of relying too heavily on counter movements through government institutions. And so what we see here is the share of wealth in the United States owned by the top 0.01% of households. And this describes what we see here were the mechanisms coming out of the Great Depression that sought to rebalance the economy. And what those did is they effectively created what today is the middle class in the US. And in Canada, of course, we experience very similar effects as well. And for a long period of time, up until the early 1980s, this was known as the Great Compression, where there was more equity within the economy, more equality within the economy, financially, economically, and a middle class formed through this period. And what, as I describe in my book, happened in the early 1980s is through the Reagan administration and subsequent administrations, many of those protections, many of those mechanisms that looked to balance competition within the marketplace, including in grocery retail, many of those were dismantled. The resources were no longer there to enforce those laws. And what we saw is what we see today is more and more consolidation within the food system. Companies like Kroger and Walmart becoming more and more powerful than they ever were. Walmart entering into grocery in the 1980s. And so, what really this describes and what I want to do to help introduce the co-op interest is that political efforts to control and regulate the economy are only as good as the willingness and capacity to maintain those checks and balances. And so, every 4 years, for example, in the United States, there could be a change of administration, change of values, change of worldview, and the capacity and resource to help protect competition or protect communities might shift and be very uncertain and unstable from period to period. And so this is where this idea of democratizing the economy has come from over time, where this idea of people inserting themselves into the economy in more democratic ways really emerged. So it sort of comes from a place of saying, or from people saying that we don't want to wait for traditional democratic institutions to protect our needs. We want to integrate democratic principles directly into the economy and do so with something that we create ourselves. And so this is very much how co-ops formed. This quote here really helps capture some of that. This is from another book about co-ops. The absence of democracy in economics is a permanent threat to the survival of democracy in politics. So, in other words, as the economy becomes more and more consolidated and individual companies and individuals become more and more powerful in being able to influence those democratic institutions, one way that people have seen over time and today see as an opportunity is to integrate democratic values and principles into the economy to protect democratic principles. And so counter movements are very much why food co-ops formed over many periods of time where systems and institutions failed. So what we have see through history is that there were food co-ops, and when I say food co-ops, I'm speaking of grocery co-ops. They followed the Industrial Revolution. They followed those progressive era monopolies, racial discrimination and inequities, the Great Depression, economic prosperity and disparity of the 50s and 60s is what really formed the 1970s era co-ops, of which there are still many today. Globalization, more recent grocery mergers, the financial crisis, and also something that's happening both rurally and urban communities is food deserts, food desertification. And so what we see through these periods is captured in these two quotes here from two Canadian co-op leaders, is that generally co-ops, whatever kind of co-op they are, whether it's a credit union, an agricultural co-op, or a grocery co-op, is that each of them is a microcosm of what is happening to a community. And each offers an insight into communities' response to challenge. And as Tom Webb says, cooperatives are the radical center, whereas capitalism and communism have a history of consolidating power into fewer and fewer hands. Cooperatives spread power around. So really, this is just the backstory to why I ended up writing a book about food co-ops, why I'm so passionate about co-ops in general, why I choose to own so many of them. And I should add, co-ops are not a retirement savings plan, even though I'm an owner of all of these businesses and co-ops. I think the only income I derived last year from any of them was $20 in grocery credit at my co-op. And I went on a book tour and traveled all across the US, spent quite a bit of time in Minnesota, sharing the story of my book. And really, again, this really emphasizes how important I think this is. In the back of my van, asked this question: who owns your grocery store? So, some of just the history of co-ops that I want to just summarize here from my book is there is a very strong history within Black communities, dating back to the late 19th century, of the co-op model being used to support Black communities in agriculture, housing, retail. There were also many immigrants that came from Europe who brought cooperative values with them. In Minnesota, many of those were Scandinavian, bringing cooperative values, which is why Minnesota has such a strong cooperative community today. And some of those co-ops, like this one that formed in the late 19 or the early 1930s in Hanover, New Hampshire, are still around. This is one of the handful of Great Depression era co-ops. This co-op now has 3 grocery stores, a gas station in New Hampshire and Vermont. One of the most famous co-ops that also is no longer around from that era was the Berkeley Co-op, which grew to have 11 stores, but closed completely in the late 1980s. And even through that time, there were Black-led co-ops in places like Harlem, where Black workers were earning a lot less than their white counterparts. And this formed and encouraged organizing around the consumption that was available to them, like retailers, by forming co-op grocery stores like the Pure Food Co-op Grocery. This is one of those Black-led co-ops in Chicago in the 1930s and 40s. People's Consumer Cooperative, no longer around. But the co-ops that do remain today, most of them, can find their history back to the 1970s, where it wouldn't have been so uncommon to see a Volkswagen Beetle in front of the store. This is the Puget Consumers Co-op in Seattle. These co-ops have really remained in part because they found a niche, and they weren't really competing with the large grocers. So many of the food co-ops you see today in the US are natural, organic food focused. In Canada, that's not the case. So the success of co-ops is not dependent on what products are on the shelf, but this is one of the reasons co-ops in the US have really been successful. In Canada, the vast majority of them are selling the same products that most of the largest grocers are selling. And there are 325 food co-op locations across the US. This is just a screenshot from one of the resources I have on my website. And you can see they come in every shape and size and color, which are photos here from my trip in 2019, visiting co-ops, about 130 of them actually in 2019 that I got to visit over the span of 6 months. A quick story about my co-op, just so you have a more visual context, I guess. And certainly if when we get into some conversation afterwards, if you want to ask me about my experience with co-ops, I can speak about them. And this is the co-op that I first joined in 2006, and I became a board director. And so for me, as a board director, I was elected by the other thousands of members to represent them and their interests. And so my job as a board director, and I was one of 7 board directors, was to employ our general manager. And the general manager would run the store as you all would, in this case, hiring a management team and staff. And so the board is there representing the owners, and that was my role for 10 years. This is what our co-op looked like about 10 years later in 2016. And then today, we have since moved into that building you saw earlier. So I live in a community of 11,000 people. And like many rural communities, it's a hub for a wider region. So people come to our co-op and our grocery store from easily over an hour away. Distances where I live generally are a bit more, are a bit longer, that people are willing to travel, partly because we live in the mountains. The co-op today employs 155 people. So this is on the larger side of food co-ops and grocery stores. We are one of the 4 largest grocers now in this community, and the other 3 are owned by the three largest grocers in Western Canada. And so we compete with those three. But our co-op has generally focused on organic food, natural food, although that's starting to shift as consumer interest changes. Inflation also puts pressure on what people can afford. This is our produce department. This here is a gathering space, which is very common in food co-ops. Food co-ops often see themselves as more than just grocery stores, and so creating spaces for gathering, for events is something that's quite common, as I can only imagine would be the case with many rural grocery stores that are privately owned as well. One thing our co-op has done, and what many co-ops do, is vertically integrate into the food supply chain. So rather than rely entirely on food coming from a distributor or one of a number of distributors, our co-op, our store is producing everything you see here inside the kitchen. This allows the co-op to use products from the shelves that maybe otherwise would be getting thrown out. They can get turned into products that sell that day or the next day. This here, just an example in the kitchen. And it also means that, we're needing to employ more people in the store. It means that more of the food dollar stays in the local economy. And there is also a meat department. This is on the larger side of a meat department for a food co-op. But what this has meant is we get to support many of the local meat producers in the region. And everything you see here is also made in site. So the butcher that has long been integral to the grocery store, particularly rural grocery stores, this is something that has been, I want to say, has remained alive in our grocery store, but this is something new that we couldn't do in our previous location, which was too small. So this is actually a new addition to the co-op, to being able to cure meats and smoke meats and package them on site and make sausages. And so this is something that has become more and more important to food co-ops, and I think also helps to describe the um, the interest that many food co-ops have in their local food supply chain and in their local economy to be more than just a store. And so here's an example of a co-op in Keene, New Hampshire. This one is only, I believe, 20 years old. It's not as old as the 1970s co-ops, but they recently purchased this building you see in the bottom. This is a food production facility that had been put up for sale, and they purchased that building and are now producing products for their purposes in their store. This co-op here in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which also has a location in Rochester, Minnesota, recently purchased a bakery. So one of their main suppliers, a baker that you see here in the bottom right, was going to be going out of business. And rather than lose that important supply, they went out and bought that business. And I've seen a handful of examples of this now, of co-ops purchasing bakeries. And a shout out to Mana Food Co-op, which I'm sure Zachary would be very pleased about here. Mana Food Co-op in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. This is a co-op that has been really innovative. I'd be sharing this slide regardless of whether Zachary here, who's involved with the co-op, was on this webinar or not. So this co-op is integrating a commercial kitchen into its store, in its new store that you see here being constructed in the bottom right, and some of that commercial equipment in the bottom left. So again, here is an example of a rural co-op really thinking outside of the box. And what co-ops can be beyond just grocery is also illustrated from this co-op here in Vermont. So this is a 1970s era rural co-op in Plainfield, Vermont, that had outgrown its space but wasn't able to find adequate space in the community, but the hardware store was up for sale. And so the co-op came in, purchased the hardware store. So the co-op grocery store is now inside the hardware store. And this co-op is no longer just a grocery store, it's a hardware store, pet supply store, and a garden center, because that's also what the hardware store was servicing and supplying into their community. And again, co-ops, food co-ops are not only restricted to grocery. This is a small co-op in Ontario, Canada, that opened a little over 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. Very small. It's one of the smallest grocery co-ops that I've been in. And they recognized a need in their community for really healthy prepared foods. And so a big part of their business is preparing food here, as you see on the right. They have a pretty extensive menu, but they're also catering, and they're also supplying, food to institutions through the kitchen. And this has become something that they've focused on. So again, that idea that co-ops respond to whatever the community needs, this is just another example of that. And one last example of that, just in the context of food, is many co-ops really do want to support people in their community of all income levels. So this is just one example of something co-ops have often done, which is once a week offering a really affordable $3, maybe it's a $5 dinner menu for people to come in and be able to eat a healthy, affordable meal. And one thing that has challenged co-ops throughout the US over the previous, particularly 25 years, has been consolidation within distribution. So because most food co-ops in the US are focused on natural and organic foods, these are the two primary distributors of those foods that have become really dominant through acquisition and as you see here. And so 25 years ago, co-ops got together and formed a co-op of co-ops that's known as National Co-op Grocers. Independent natural food stores also did this through what's known as Infra. Both of those organizations are headquartered in Minnesota. And so about 165 food co-ops now own National Co-op Grocers, and they support their member co-ops through branding, like you see here. It's a shared brand. It's optional for co-ops to use that brand, but they also are able to bring much more accessible prices because that co-op is brokering deals with those distributors on behalf of their member co-ops. So allowing those independent stores, similar to Associated Wholesale Grocers, to operate like a chain. And I speak about co-ops as being focused on natural and organic foods, but I just want to show you this flyer from a new co-op in Dayton, Ohio, which in fact is 100% focused on anything but really natural and organic foods. They certainly have some of those foods in the store, but this is a co-op that formed in a USDA designated food desert in order to serve a community that had been without a grocery store, I think, there for over 8 to 10 years. And so you can see this private label brand. This is a brand that is serviced by SuperValue, which is also now owned by UNFI. And what National Co-op Grocers is now doing is working to help broker those deals as well for co-ops that are focused on a different product mix than the more traditional natural and organic food co-ops. So this is a sector that's really changing and evolving as the needs of co-ops change and as different co-ops start to form. Co-ops do form with the support of this organization. This is the Food Co-op Initiative, which was formed by the sector in 2005. They, in the past 20 years, have helped 175 new food co-ops successfully open. They're currently working with about 95, a list of which I maintain on my website. And they provide guidance and resources on how to start a strong and sustainable food co-op. And one of the other things that they do is host the up and coming food co-op conference every year. It's this year in Kalamazoo, next week, next year in Detroit. And there are anywhere from 250 to 350 people that arrive from all over the country to explore either building a co-op from scratch or converting an existing grocery store into a co-op, which is becoming more common. And just some photos here of new co-ops. I visited this one being built in Woodstock, Illinois. And as co-ops are being built, they of course need community support. And so a big part of that involves strong communications, like you see here. It often involves setting up at farmers markets and inviting people to become founding owners, which can be anywhere from $200 to $300 that people are investing in equity. People put up signs on their lawn, and oftentimes co-ops will be able to finance their buildings through community investment. And so founding owners are asked to loan money to the co-op. And this also then supports additional funding coming through other groups, whether it's from shared capital co-op, local credit unions, banks, and other cooperative funding institutions that will finance and fund co-op development. And this here is an image of that store now open as of last year. And the interest in co-ops, I mean, so these are new co-ops that I think can trace a lot of their history, like this one to the 1970s era co-ops. But you also have what has been showing up in rural communities and comes back to this quote here that each co-op is a microcosm of what's happening to communities. And that's where we come to, one of the challenges or some of the challenges that we find in rural communities in Minnesota and other states. And so I just want to share lastly here before we open it up to some questions and a quick exercise to help you formulate those questions. I'll just share some examples of co-ops that have formed as conversions out of existing grocery stores. So this one here is in a community of 200 people. This is in Lynch, Nebraska. And through the pandemic, they were forced to close because of the many reasons we all know. It stressed this store beyond its capacity, and the store closed. And this community rallied together very quickly, and in 2022 converted that store into a co-op. And today, as of last year, this co-op recorded $1 million in sales, which is fantastic in a community of only 200 people. In this case, this is a store where the staff are paid, but the management are volunteers. And so that is, I would say, uncommon. Most co-ops are staffed by paid management, paid staff. There are some that still have volunteer workers. But in a rural community of 200 people, this is probably what makes this store work. This is an example of a grocery store that's been around for over 100 years in Cummington, Massachusetts. In 1988, a couple purchased this store as a retirement project because this was the only gathering place in the community, the only store in the community. But the next owners, about 12 years later, found that this was far too hard of a business to operate on their own. They reached out to the community and in 2012, they were able to convert it to a co-op as it is today, and it's still functioning and successful today. At their first meeting where they announced that they wanted to do this, they had 300 people show up in the community, which just really shows you that when a store as important as a grocery store is potentially going to close, that people do show up and respond. And one of those examples is this one here. This is in Nordland, Washington. This was a store and is a store that supplies the only groceries for the entire island of Marrowstone Island. There was a fire that gutted this building, and the owners, who were nearing retirement, didn't want to go through that process of trying to bring the store back to life. And so the community got together, and they were able to raise $500,000. More than 450 founding owners invested into turning this store into a co-op, and just last year they reopened the store as a co-op. And this is what that store looks like today. This is the Nordland General Store, again operating in this community for over 100 years. And so this would be an interesting website to explore, and I just have a screenshot here of their website because part of what they needed to do was educate their community as to what a food co-op is. In Washington State, similar to Minnesota, I think co-ops are quite familiar to many people, but not to everyone. And so this is just an example of their website. Some other examples of this happening near you. This is Hudson, Wisconsin, just across the border, where this store here on the left, the owner unexpectedly passed away, and a group of people who had been trying to build a co-op were already formed, and they came in and were able to acquire the business, and it's now a co-op. And this is happening more and more. This was just a couple months ago. A natural food store in Clinton, New York had closed its doors. The community came together and reopened it just a couple months ago as Tom's Natural Foods. So one of those resources that's available is this action guide from the Food Co-op Initiative, which is converting your grocery store to a co-op. So this is available for free as a starting point. And for sake of time, I'm just going to fast forward through some of these slides here just to recapture some of what I was sharing earlier, that co-ops really are more than just grocery stores, as is the case with rural grocery stores. They often are more than just grocery stores. They are often the one place where people really gather and connect with each other. Um, they can help incubate small businesses, as you see here, local economic development agency. They're often involved in food and kitchen education, community development. And the way communities show up for their co-ops is something that I just noticed last week when I visited this little co-op in a town of 1,000 people in Republic, Washington. And it turned out, unbeknownst to me as I before I got there, that somebody had recently donated this building on the left to the co-op, uh, and the co-op is now figuring out how to expand into that building. And this is not something we would normally notice in the private sector. But when co-ops are driven by communities, we end up seeing these types of philanthropic efforts, like the owner of that building donating it to the co-op. And so this is now what the co-op is imagining expanding into in this community here in Republic, Washington. And so lastly, this is my website. So I have some resources on my site about food co-ops, about how food co-ops get started. This is also a resource that's available for free digitally online and in print. I'd encourage you to flip through the pages. Inside are photos, over 200 photos of co-ops all over the country to give you a sense of what a food co-op can be. And if you're looking to find food co-ops across the US, there's even a mobile app that I helped produce and publish. You can find this on my website, and you can also download it onto your phone. And two other shout outs. These are two other books that are written about and from within Minnesota about co-ops. The one on the left is an older title from, I believe, the 1980s or 90s. And the one on the right is a more recent one that came out a little after my book came out, The Radical History of Food Cooperatives in Minnesota. So two books I'd recommend. What we've decided we would do in this last moment is engage in a little bit of a Q&A, but rather than jump right into a Q&A, there were a few prompts that I thought each of you could take just a moment or two to consider before we open it up for a conversation. There are three questions, and these are just prompts for you to explore just what you're imagining since hearing some of what I've just shared, but then also what questions might help support more learning for you about this topic. And, we have another 15 minutes or so, so maybe we can take a couple minutes just for this, and then we can open it up for some conversation. So write down up to three things that are active in your thinking, feeling right now that leaves you skeptical about food co-ops. Write down up to three things that inspire you about the idea, and write down up to three questions you'd like answered to support your learning about the topic. We'll start with the first two rather than the third of the three questions. So the first two questions, write down three things that are active in your thinking that leaves you skeptical, and three things that inspire you about the idea. Is there anything anyone would like to share from their answers?
Looks like Adam got a chat in here for the first.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess my most pressing question is not any one of these, but I will put out there. Yeah, the idea that cooperatives seem to have a great network, resources, and potentially buying power. And one of my underlying questions was the fact that the Robinson-Patman Act in the U.S. is no longer enforced, allows Costco and Walmart to buy food a lot cheaper, and the mom and pop small shops kind of get priced out. So the question behind the question is there any way for co-ops or small grocers to also get that kind of leverage to get better pricing?
Okay. Yeah, well, let me answer that question now because I know that's generally one of the most important questions, perhaps, that comes up around food co-ops. So, what I've seen within National Co-op Grocers, which again is the co-op of co-ops, is that organization that co-ops have formed have allowed co-ops to be absolutely price competitive. But within that field of natural and organic foods, which is a different world than all the other food that's on the shelves of grocery stores. And so I think what National Co-op Grocers has demonstrated is that it's possible for those foods and for more conventional foods that more and more folks are familiar with, that sort of is still to be determined. What I've seen, though, in Canada is that we have a network of co-ops. There's about 400 of them in Canada that are conventional. And Federated Co-op is the co-op of co-ops that's the most powerful in Canada. And they have certainly demonstrated that in communities that, particularly those that don't have many grocery options, that they have been able to remain competitive and remain relevant in those communities. Bit of a disclaimer with them is that many of those co-ops also rely on revenues from fuel. So a lot of the grocery co-ops in Canada also have gas stations, liquor stores, convenience stores, and increasingly, at least in the case of the co-op in Calgary, cannabis stores. But Calgary is a more urban co-op. But in the co-ops in more rural communities, they are sometimes the only grocer, put it that way. And they are benefiting from Federated Co-op, which is one of the largest 5 food distributors now in Western Canada. So those co-op members are from Manitoba all across to British Columbia, and they even support the co-ops up in the Arctic. But in the US, of course, there isn't an organization that is of that scale yet. And so I think this is one of the reasons why we're still, I think it's safe to say, in the infancy stage of the co-op model in the US being used for anything other than this more traditional use of the co-op model, which is natural and organic foods.
Can I jump in too?
Sure.
I'm just gonna throw a link in here for infra. So we're a
Mm-hmm.
smaller co-op, and there was a time where NCG, National Co-op Grocers, which is a network of co-ops, some buying power, didn't allow stores that had less than $1 million in sales. And there's a reason for that. I mean, if you've got too small of a store, you're going to be impeding, right, on this buying power. And that's where buying power comes from, is buying bulk. So Infra accepted us in, at that time, we were about 500,000 in sales, and we were the first co-op to join, and they're a co-op themselves. And I'm board president of Mana Food Co-op, and I've got to say we're never been happier with Infra. They are not just for co-ops too; they're for independent natural foods grocery stores. So if you're out there and you're an independent grocery store and you're interested in maybe changing your product mix to be a little bit more on the natural food side of things, there's a few stores in Minnesota, the Clean Plate in Monaga, Mana Foods, Dutchman Organics. There's a few others as well, and yeah, I'd say they've got really nice support, and they do offer a few things to a store that helps with that collective buying power and get some pricing down. And I'd say we're competitive in some levels with an Aldi because we've got organic beans for $1.29, and we can hit on some of those lower price points because they're buying in bulk. So I'd say just like NCG, just like National Co-op Grocers, Infra is, and they've got a growth trajectory right now. So they're kind of on the up and up. And if you're interested, I could connect you with somebody from there as well. Yeah, Char's got her hand up here. We answer,
Okay.
Char?
Hi, I just wanted to know, to Zachary, like where Zachary's, I'm from Minnesota. I'm a co-op developer in Minnesota with Cooperative Development Services. Zachary's co-op also has the pressures of having a super Walmart and like a retail, like conventional grocery store literally in its like back parking lot. So if they can make it work, I mean, and they've grown, it's really nice to hear, that infra is allowing you to be competitive, more so than maybe not.
Yeah, and it takes finding being creative, right? Like, so we're, I won't talk too much about our co-op, but um, we're downtown. We're like right downtown Detroit Lakes. There's no grocery store downtown, and it's also potentially not smart to put a grocery store right in your downtown because of parking lot issues and other issues. But for us, it works because where I was just telling John before that we're kind of a lakes community and people come downtown. That's where a lot of tourists come. So we have a lot of awareness and we're distinct from other stores. So it's all about being adaptable, being creative, and figuring out what works for you. So if you're out there and you're a little bit bigger of an independent store and you're serving more people, that, you'll have a different idea of what might work best. But yeah, for where your community is and where they shop, looking at all the factors, which is, pretty much infinite, but that's where people like Shar and myself and John and we've got some great technical assistants here at the University of Minnesota to help if you've got questions along the way. Um, Put you in touch with the right people to help you through some questions that you might have to make your store more profitable or any other questions you have about grocery.
Mhm.
I can't get my raised hand to work,
Yeah, I
so
see
I'm just going
Valerie,
to
you have
talk.
your hand. Yeah, I see. Yep.
I just feel like there's conversation is so different for different people here. I look at the co-op. So for our grocery store that's about to close and to find a solution to have food resources in our town compared to, okay, yeah, you're downtown Detroit Lakes, but there's a super Walmart, there's grocery stores, there's opportunity for people to get food compared to these places where we're driving 35, 40 miles to get food.
Yep.
So we want to keep this in our backyard. So I think these co-op conversations can be so very different. And I think a lot of what you showed, so, obviously our places with, population and industry and tourism and things that can keep them going. But if you're a small rural farming community, I look at this as why would we start a cooperative when the store is failing? Yes, to keep the service available to the community, but are we just setting ourselves up for failure? Or, because we don't have the buying power, because we don't have the network, why is this our option? I don't know. I don't know how to answer or, what the question really is. It's just how can the co-op be the answer to the struggling grocery store?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think
I was going to
I just
ask
want to
John.
speak.
Oh yeah, I was just going to also like reframe and also, and if
Sure.
you have any examples of rural, smaller than, Detroit Lakes, we got 10,000.
Mhm.
Virginia, Minnesota, they've got a co-op there. It's thriving with I think the general manager said a town of 8,000, 4 million in sales a year. They're a co-op, but I don't know if John, if you had any examples of more rural co-ops that are doing that too.
Well, I think one thing that's really important to identify is to acknowledge the possibility that a community might no longer be able to sustain a grocery store. Like this is something I've watched. I've through as much as I can pay attention to these types of efforts across the US and Canada. There was a recent one, for example, where the municipality came in and acquired the store, hoping to sustain it for the community, and even they couldn't do it. Um, the business that leased the store to then try to manage it also couldn't do it. And whether or not that's the product of management or maybe it's just that the community can no longer sustain a store. This is a possibility. But there are examples though, like the one I shared of Lynch, Nebraska, in a community of 200 people that clearly have a unique model where the management is not being paid and the community is volunteering, where there are creative, innovative ways to sustain a store that in their case is doing $1 million in sales. There's another store just recently announced that they just got some grant money. This is in Farmer City, Illinois. Uh, Great name for a community that you would like to think has a grocery store. They don't have a grocery store, and the closest stores to them, I think, are in that sort of 20 to 30 minute drive away. They're in the development phase. But I think what would be helpful for anyone kind of in that similar space is to start to connect with those communities and find out what's working and what's not working.
Yeah, and I'll say point out like a co-op isn't exactly what you might imagine as a co-op. Like Finland, Minnesota, town of 220 has the oldest co-op in Minnesota, and they're like a gas station, convenience store.
Hmm.
When you walk in, it's like they're selling, everyday products, not necessarily organic. So it's whatever the people in that community want it to be. And then when you have these collective buying power, collective people owning the store, perhaps if it's right for your community that it could be beneficial. And then I would just point out to say New London has a new food co-op, and that's a population of 1,000 pretty much. So there can be workable solutions to smaller towns. Sorry, I have another point.
To Valerie, your inspiration. I've toured the Lynch Co-op last year as part of a spring meeting of co-op developers, an association. And they will tell you, obviously, yes, they wanted to keep their grocery store because they were like 40, 50 miles away from the next. But they rallied, they all got together and said, is this important? What are you gonna do? I mean, it wasn't something that just happened. So if the grocery store maybe already currently going down, that might not it might be an indicator of what a co-op is, and it might not be an indicator, right? Because it's going to be it will be different. But what they did say, the folks that were working there, is that it was a farmer. He's like, I never thought in a million years I would be like involved in a grocery store in my community. But I realized the importance. And they all came together, but that doesn't happen in every community. But they made it work, and it's possible. And one of the people that were in that picture that John showed was Charlotte Nargis from the University of Nebraska, who helped them. But it is a process, but it is possible, and we are hearing as a co-op development center more and more. Obviously, as folks are here, the loss of rural grocery stores. So that is, yeah.
And I just want to point out one last thing is like
Mhm.
when there's a capital campaign in a small town, people pay attention. Like if there's a grocery store and there's more than just one owner, but there's 5 or there's 10 or there's 20, and there's some movement around, okay, we got to raise some money here. It could potentially be a wake-up call to more people getting involved, and so there are these. It's a boost. It could give a boost of energy with a capital campaign when you have your first step, um, and the support could be greater as well with more owners than just one or two, than with 5 or 10 or 20, and then the bank gets involved, and then other aspects of the town could probably get involved too. But
Mhm.
not every model's for every place though. So and there's all sorts of different solutions for different um, towns and stores. Well, thanks so much, John, for joining our Minnesota cohort here. Certainly gleaned a lot of information, and we'll have this video up on the website so you can watch at your leisure, pause it, watch it again. There's so much good information here. So thanks.
Yeah, and thank you for the invite, Zachary, and for all of you for all your good work in either developing co-ops or running your grocery stores. And I will be at the Rural Grocery Summit in Fargo next year, and so hope to meet some of you there if you end up attending.